History. We're taught to believe it is fixed, written down, verified. If it's in a book, it must be true. But pause for a moment. What if everything you think you know about history is not truth, but repetition? We rarely question history. We memorize it, we inherit it, we accept it because it comes with confidence. But history does not tell the whole truth. It tells a selected truth, and the question is, who did the selecting? The victors, those in power, those who controlled what could be written and what had to be forgotten. Here's the dangerous part. A lie repeated often enough doesn't sound like a lie anymore. It becomes fact. You were told that Spartans killed weak infants, that Vikings wore horned helmets, that people in the Middle Ages believed the earth was flat, and you believed it, not because it was proven, but because it was simple, because it looked good in movies, because no one encouraged you to ask why. But history is not simple. It is messy, contradictory, and sometimes deliberately distorted. What you're about to hear won't erase history, but it will change how you look at it, because this video reveals 10 truths in history that were built on lies. Some were honest mistakes, some were propaganda, and some existed for one reason only: control. And perhaps the most unsettling realization of all. You didn't believe these stories because they were true. You believed them because everyone else did. Fact 1. Vikings wore horned helmets. This is one of the most powerful images in popular history. When we think of Vikings, we don't imagine farmers, traders, or explorers. We imagine warriors, fierce faces, axes in their hands, and almost always horned helmets. Movies, TV series, paintings, video games, even children's books repeat this image so often that it feels unquestionable. The horns look ancient, they look savage, they look authentic. But here is the uncomfortable truth. That image is not real, not historically real. To this day, archaeologists have uncovered dozens of Viking helmets, iron helmets, leather helmets, simple, functional designs built for survival. And among all of them, not a single one has horns. Not one. No horned helmets in archaeological excavations. None found on battlefields. None shown in Viking Age carvings, coins, or contemporary illustrations. Which raises an obvious question. If Vikings really wore horned helmets, where did they all go? The answer is simple. They never existed. Vikings were not fantasy warriors. They were practical fighters who understood combat very well. A horned helmet would have been a disaster. It would throw off balance. It would give enemies something to grab. It would turn the wearer's head into a lever. In real battle, horns don't make you fearsome. They make you vulnerable. So if this image is false, why is it everywhere? Because the myth didn't come from history, it came from theater. In the 19th century, Europe became fascinated with Viking legends. Operas, stage plays, and romanticized epics wanted Vikings to look wild, primitive, and terrifying. And theater has one rule: exaggeration sells. Costume designers added horns, not for accuracy, but for impact. From a distance, horns made silhouettes larger, more aggressive, more memorable. The audience loved it. And that's where the real danger begins. Because once an image becomes popular enough, it stops being questioned. Paintings copied the stage. Illustrations copied the paintings. Early films copied the illustrations. Modern cinema copied all of them. And slowly, silently, a theatrical costume became a historical fact. No one stopped to ask, is this actually true? We didn't believe the horned helmet because it was proven. We believed it because it was familiar. This is how historical myths survive. Not through evidence, but through repetition. And this isn't just a story about Vikings. It's a warning. Because if one of the most famous images in history is completely wrong, how many others are we accepting without question? One small visual change, repeated for decades, then centuries, and eventually, fiction replaces memory. The Vikings didn't wear horned helmets, but the myth tells us something far more important. History doesn't lie loudly. It lies quietly until no one remembers the difference. Fact 2. Spartans killed weak infants. This is one of the darkest stories ever told about ancient Sparta. We are often told that Spartans were so brutal that they inspected newborn babies, and if a child appeared weak, sick, or imperfect, it was thrown away to die. The image is chilling, and for centuries it has defined how we see Sparta: heartless, merciless, obsessed with strength. But here's the problem. There is no solid evidence that this happened systematically. Almost everything we know about this practice comes from later writers, mostly Spartan enemies, writers who lived centuries after Sparta's peak, writers who never witnessed these events themselves. And archaeology tells a very different story. Excavations in Sparta do not reveal mass infant graves. There is no physical evidence of large-scale baby killings, no layers of bones, no hidden burial sites. What we do know is this: Sparta, like every ancient society, struggled with infant mortality. Disease, malnutrition, and harsh conditions claimed many lives. Not execution. Spartan society was harsh, yes, but it was also deeply communal. Children were not just the property of their parents. They belonged to the state, and the state had every reason to keep its population alive. So why did this story survive? Because it was useful. For Athens and later writers, Sparta needed to be the opposite of civilization: cruel where others were enlightened, savage where others were humane. The story of killing weak infants wasn't just a horror tale. It was propaganda, a way to turn a rival society into a monster. This doesn't mean Sparta was gentle, it wasn't. But the idea that Spartans casually murdered newborns says more about those who wrote the story than about Sparta itself. And once again, we see the same pattern: a shocking claim, repeated often, never questioned, until it becomes history. Fact 3. People in the Middle Ages believed the earth was flat. This is one of the most popular myths in history. We're often told that during the Middle Ages, people believed the earth was flat, and that anyone who disagreed was considered ignorant or heretical. But this is simply not true. Educated people in the Middle Ages knew the earth was round. They learned it from ancient Greek scholars like Aristotle. They calculated it using astronomy. They even taught it in medieval universities. The idea of a flat earth wasn't medieval ignorance, it was a modern invention. In the 19th century, writers wanted to portray the Middle Ages as dark, backward, and anti-science. So they created a simple story: ignorant people, a flat earth, and heroic modern thinkers. It worked. The myth was repeated in books, classrooms, and popular culture until it replaced reality. Once again, history wasn't misunderstood by accident. It was reshaped to tell a better story, and the earth was never flat. Fact 4. Gladiators always fought to the death. This is one of the bloodiest myths in history. Popular culture tells us that every gladiator fight in ancient Rome ended the same way, with death, crowds screaming, blood everywhere, one man leaving the arena alive. But this image is deeply exaggerated. The truth is, most gladiator fights did not end in death. Gladiators were not disposable prisoners. They were expensive professionals. They were trained for years, fed specialized diets, housed, treated, and medically cared for. Killing a gladiator in every fight would have been financially insane. Records, inscriptions, and graffiti show that many gladiators fought dozens of matches over long careers. Some even became celebrities with fans, endorsements, and fame. Death did happen, but it was the exception, not the rule. In fact, referees were present in the arena. Rules existed, and surrender was possible. A defeated gladiator could be spared if he fought well and entertained the crowd. So why does the myth survive? Because death sells. Roman writers exaggerated brutality, modern films amplified it, and violence became the easiest way to define Rome's cruelty. But the real Colosseum was not a constant slaughterhouse. It was a business, a spectacle, a controlled form of violence. And once again, history teaches us something uncomfortable. We don't remember the past as it was. We remember it as we want it to feel, more dramatic, more savage, more simple. But reality is always more complex. Fact 5. Ancient people were ignorant. This is one of the most arrogant myths we still believe. We often look at the ancient world and imagine ignorance, superstition, people who didn't understand science, nature, or the universe. But that image says more about us than about them. Ancient civilizations were not stupid. They were observant, patient, and deeply intelligent in ways we often underestimate. The ancient Egyptians calculated the length of the year with astonishing accuracy. They aligned massive stone monuments with stars and solstices, without modern instruments. Ancient Greeks measured the circumference of the earth using nothing but shadows and geometry. They debated atoms, ethics, logic, and democracy thousands of years before modern science. The Maya tracked planetary movements with precision that still impresses astronomers today. Their calendars were not guesses, they were calculations. Even ancient surgeons performed operations, set broken bones, and understood anatomy through careful observation. So why do we call them ignorant? Because their knowledge looked different from ours. Because it wasn't written in modern equations. Because it doesn't fit neatly into our textbooks. But intelligence is not measured by technology alone. It is measured by understanding. Ancient people didn't lack intelligence. They lacked electricity. And once again, history simplifies the past to make the present feel superior. But the truth is uncomfortable. Much of what we know today stands on foundations they built. They were not ignorant. They were pioneers. And forgetting that is the real ignorance. Fact 6. The Church destroyed all science. This is one of the most common oversimplifications in history. We're often told that the Church was the enemy of science, that it burned books, silenced thinkers, and plunged Europe into ignorance. But the reality is far more complex. Many of the scholars who preserved ancient knowledge were actually working inside the Church. Monasteries copied manuscripts, cathedrals housed libraries. Early universities grew under religious institutions. Yes, there were conflicts. Yes, some ideas were censored or punished. But science did not survive despite the Church. In many cases, it survived because of it. The Middle Ages were not a scientific blackout. They were a period of preservation, translation, and slow progress. The myth of total suppression exists because it tells a simple story, darkness versus enlightenment. But history is rarely that simple. And once again, the truth lives in the gray areas we prefer to ignore. Fact 7. Napoleon was short. This is one of the most successful insults in history. For over 2 centuries, Napoleon Bonaparte has been remembered not just as a military genius, but as a short, insecure man trying to compensate for his height. The phrase Napoleon complex exists for a reason, but here's the truth. Napoleon was not short. By the standards of his time, Napoleon was actually of average height. Historical records place him at around 5 feet 6 or 7 inches using French measurements, which made him perfectly normal for an early 19th century European man. So how did one of history's most powerful figures become remembered as small? The answer is not biology, it's propaganda. Napoleon's greatest enemy wasn't just Britain's army, it was Britain's printing press. British cartoonists relentlessly mocked him. They exaggerated his proportions. They drew him tiny next to towering soldiers. They turned him into a symbol of arrogance and insecurity. And it worked. Visual satire is powerful. Once an image takes hold, facts struggle to catch up. There was also a simple misunderstanding. France and Britain used different measurement systems. When Napoleon's height was translated incorrectly, he appeared shorter than he really was. A technical detail turned into a cultural joke. But there's something even deeper happening here. Reducing Napoleon to a short man made him easier to dismiss. Less threatening, less complex. It transformed a brilliant strategist into a caricature. And this is how history often works. Instead of confronting uncomfortable truths, genius, ambition, discipline, intelligence, we shrink people down to a single trait. Napoleon didn't conquer Europe because he was insecure. He conquered Europe because he understood logistics, psychology, and timing better than almost anyone else of his era. The myth of Napoleon's height tells us less about him and far more about how societies use ridicule as a weapon. Because when you can laugh at someone, you don't have to fear them. And once again, a repeated joke becomes a historical fact. Napoleon wasn't short, but the truth about him was deliberately cut down to size. Fact 8. Ancient wars were honorable. This is one of the most romantic lies in history. We like to imagine ancient wars as honorable. Two sides facing each other, clear rules. Brave warriors fighting for glory, duty, and pride. Swords raised, armor shining, honor above all. But this image is a fantasy. Ancient warfare was not honorable. It was chaotic, cruel, and deeply unfair. Most people who died in ancient wars were not heroic warriors. They were farmers, civilians, children, people who never chose to fight. Battles were not clean confrontations. They were ambushes, surprise attacks, night raids, starvation tactics. Winning did not mean fighting bravely. It meant surviving at any cost. Cities that lost were often destroyed completely. Men were killed. Women and children were enslaved. Homes were burned. Crops were destroyed to ensure famine. There was no honor in this, only terror. Even famous, honorable cultures understood this. Greek warfare included deception and betrayal. Roman victories relied on discipline and overwhelming force, not fairness. Vikings used raids precisely because they avoided open battle. The idea of honor came after the violence. Poets, historians, and later generations cleaned the blood away with words. They turned suffering into stories, mass death into legend. Because brutality is hard to remember, but heroism is easy to admire. The truth is simple and uncomfortable. Ancient wars were not about honor. They were about power, resources, fear. Honor was a narrative added later to make the past easier to live with. And once again, history did what it often does best. It turned trauma into romance. Fact 9. History is always written by the victors. We often hear that history is written by the victors, and that sounds convincing, but it's only half the truth because the defeated didn't disappear. They left letters, diaries, ruins, bones in the ground. History survives not only through power, but through traces that refuse to be erased. Victors may control the narrative, but evidence has a way of speaking back. Fact 10. History is objective. This may be the biggest myth of all. History is not pure truth. It is selection. What gets written, what gets ignored, what gets removed. Every history book is shaped by choices, and choices always have bias. History isn't a mirror of the past. It's a lens, and whoever holds the lens decides what we see. If this video made you question what you thought you knew, that's exactly the point. History hides more than it shows. Subscribe for more untold truths and stories history forgot. The enigmatic veil will always be here, bringing you informative and thought-provoking historical stories. The Enigmatic Veil.